In short, it seems to me quite appropriate at this moment in the development of linguistics and psychology in general to turn again to classical questions and to ask what new insights have been achieved that bear on them and how the classical issues may provide direction for contemporary research and study. When we turn to the history of study and speculation concerning the nature of mind, and more specifically, the nature of human language, our attention quite naturally comes to focus on the 17th century. Quote, the century of genius, end quote, in which the foundations of modern science were firmly established and the problems that still confound us were formulated with remarkable clarity and perspicuity. There are many, far from superficial respects, in which the intellectual climate of today resembles that of 17th century Western Europe. One, particularly crucial in the present context, is the very great extent or of interest in the potentialities and capacities of automata, a problem that intrigued the 17th century mind as fully as it does our own. I mentioned above that there is a slowly dawning of realization that a significant gap, more accurately, a yawning chasm, separates the system of concepts of which we have a fairly clear grasp on the one hand and the nature of human intelligence on the other. A similar realization lies at the base of Cartesian philosophy. Descartes also arrived quite early in his investigations at the conclusion that the study of mind faces us with a problem of quality of complexity, not merely degree of complexity. He felt that he had demonstrated that understanding and will, the two fundamental properties of the human mind, involved capacities and principles that are not realizable by even the most complex of automata. It is particularly interesting to trace the development of this argument in the works of the minor and now quite forgotten Cartesian philosophers, who wrote a fascinating treatise extending Descartes' few remarks about language, who produced a long and detailed treatise expressing, so he claimed with some reason, what Descartes would likely have said about this subject had he lived to extend his theory of man beyond physiology. One may question the details of this argument, and one can show how it was impeded and distorted by certain remnants of scholastic doctrine, the framework of substance and mode, for example. But the general structure of the argument is not unreasonable. It is, in fact, rather analogous to the argument against the framework of ideas of the early post-war years, which I mentioned at the outset. The Cartesians tried to show that when the theory of corporeal body is sharpened and clarified and extended to its limits, it is still incapable of accounting for facts that are obvious to introspection and that are also confirmed by our observation of the actions of other humans. In particular, it cannot account for the normal use of human language, just as it cannot explain the basic properties of thought. Consequently, it becomes necessary to invoke an entirely new principle, in Cartesian terms, to postulate a second substance whose essence is thought, alongside of body, with its essential properties of extension and motion. This new principle has a creative aspect, which is evidenced most clearly in what we may refer to as the creative aspect of language use, the distinctively human ability to express new thoughts and to understand entirely new expressions of thought within the framework of an instituted language, a language that is a cultural product subject to laws and principles partially unique to it and partially reflections of general properties of mind. These laws and principles, it is maintained, are not formulable in terms of even the most elaborate extension of the concepts proper to the analysis of behavior and interaction of physical bodies, and they are not realizable by even the most complex automation. In fact, Descartes argued that the only sure indication that another body possesses a human mind, that it is not a mere automation, is its ability to use language in the normal way. And he argued that this ability cannot be detected in an animal or an automation, which in other respects shows signs of apparent intelligence exceeding those of a human, even though such an organism or machine might be as fully endowed as a human with the physiological organs necessary to produce speech. I will return to this argument and the ways in which it was developed, but I think it is important to stress that with all its gaps and deficiencies, it is an argument that must be taken seriously. There is nothing at all absurd in the conclusion. It seems to me quite possible that at this particular moment in the development of Western thought, there was the possibility for the birth of a science of psychology of a sort that still does not exist, a psychology that begins with the problem of characterizing various systems of human knowledge and belief, the concepts in terms of which they are organized and the principles that underlie them, and that only then turns to the study of how these systems might have developed through some combination of innate structure and organism-environment interaction. Such a psychology would contrast rather sharply with the approach to human intelligence that begins by postulating, on a priori grounds, certain specific mechanisms that, it is claimed, must be those underlying the acquisition of all knowledge and belief. The distinction is one to which I will return in a subsequent lecture. For the moment, I want merely to stress the reasonableness of the rejected alternative, and, what is more, its consistency with the approach that proved so successful in the 17th century revolution in physics. There are methodological parallels that have perhaps been inadequately appreciated between the Cartesian postulation of a substance whose essence was thought and the post-Newtonian acceptance of a principle of attraction as an innate property of the ultimate corpuscles of matter, an active principle that governs the motions of bodies. Perhaps the most far-reaching contribution of Cartesian philosophy to modern thought was its rejection of the scholastic notion of substantial forms and real qualities, of all those little images fluttering through the air, to which Descartes referred with derision. With the exorcism of these occult qualities, the stage was set for the rise of a physics of matter in motion and a psychology that explored the properties of mind. But Newton argued that Descartes' mechanical physics would not work. The second book of the Principia is largely devoted to this demonstration, and that it is necessary to postulate a new force to account for the motion of bodies. The postulate of an attractive force acting at a distance was inconsistent with the clear and distinct ideas of common sense and could not be tolerated by an orthodox Cartesian. Such a force was merely another occult quality. Sir Isaac Newton quite agreed, and he attempted repeatedly to find a mechanical explanation of the cause of gravity. He rejected the view that gravity is essential and inherent to matter, and maintained that to tell us that every species of things is endowed with an occult specific property such as gravity, by which it acts and produces manifest effects, is to tell us nothing. Some historians of science have suggested that Newton hoped, like Descartes, to write a Principles of Philosophy, but that his failure to explain the cause of gravity on mechanical grounds restricted him to a mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Thus, to the common sense of Newton as well as the Cartesians, physics was still not adequately grounded because it postulated a mystical force capable of action at a distance. Similarly, Descartes' postulation of mind as an explanatory principle was unacceptable to the empiricist temper. But the astonishing success of mathematical physics carried the day against these common-sense objections, and the prestige of the new physics was so high that the speculative psychology of the Enlightenment of the 18th century took for granted the necessity of working with the Newtonian framework rather than on the Newtonian analogy, a very different matter. The occult force of gravity was accepted as an obvious element of the physical world, requiring no explanation, and it became inconceivable that one might have to postulate entirely new principles of functioning and organization outside the framework of what soon became the new common sense. Partly for this reason, the search for an analogous scientific psychology that would explore the principles of mind, whatever they might be, was not undertaken with the thoroughness that was then, as now, quite possible. I do not want to overlook a fundamental distinction between the postulation of gravity and the postulation of a res cognitans, namely the enormous disparity in the power of the explanatory theories that were developed. Nevertheless, I think it is instructive to note that the reasons for the dissatisfaction of Newton, Leibniz, and the orthodox Cartesians with the new physics are strikingly similar to the grounds on which a dualistic rationalist psychology was soon to be rejected. I think it is correct to say that the study of properties and organization of mind was prematurely abandoned, in part on quite spurious grounds, and also to point out that there is a certain irony in the common view that its abandonment was caused by the gradual spread of a more general scientific attitude. I have tried to call attention to some similarities between the intellectual climate of the 17th century and that of today. It is illuminating, I think, to trace in somewhat greater detail the specific course of development of linguistic theory during the modern period, in the context of the study of mind and of behavior in general. For additional details and discussion, see my Cartesian Linguistics and the references cited there. A good place to begin is with the writings of the Spanish physician Juan Huarte, who in the late 16th century, respectively, published a widely translated study on the nature of human intelligence. In the course of his investigations, he came to wonder at the fact that the word for intelligence, ingenio, seems to have the same Latin root as various words meaning engender or generate. This, he argued, gives a clue to the nature of mind. Thus, one may discern two generative powers in man, one common with the beasts and the plants, and the other participating of spiritual substance. Ingenio is a generative power. Thus, the understanding is a generative faculty. His etymology is actually not very good. The insight, however, is quite substantial. Huarte goes on to distinguish three levels of intelligence. The lowest of these is the docile wit, which satisfies the maximum that he, along with Leibniz and many others, wrongly attributes to Aristotle, namely that there is nothing in the mind that is not simply transmitted to it by the senses. The next higher level, normal human intelligence, goes well beyond the empiricist limitation. It is able to, quote, engender within itself by its own power the principles on which knowledge rests, end quote. Normal human mind is such that, assisted by the subject alone without the help of anybody, it will produce 1,000 conceits and they never heard spoke of, inventing and saying such things as never heard from their masters, nor any mouth. Thus, normal human intelligence is capable of acquiring knowledge through its own internal resources, perhaps making use of the data of sense, but going on to construct a cognitive system in terms of concepts and principles that are developed on independent grounds, and it is capable of generating new thoughts and of finding appropriate and novel ways of expressing them, in ways that entirely transcend any training or experience. And so, Juan Huarte postulates a third kind of wit, quote, by means of which some, without art or study, speak such subtle and surprising things, yet true, that were never before seen, heard, or writ, no, nor even so much as thought of, end quote. The reference here is to true creativity, an exercise of the creative imagination in ways that go beyond normal intelligence and may, he felt, involve a mixture of madness. Huarte maintains that the distinction between docile wit, which meets the empiricist maxim, and normal intelligence with its full generative capacities, is the distinction between beast and man. As a physician, Juan Huarte was much interested in pathology. In particular, he notes that the most severe disability of wit that can afflict a human is a restriction to the lowest of the three levels, to the docile wit that conforms to empiricist principles. This disability, says Huarte, resembles that of eunuchs, incapable of generation. Under these sad circumstances in which the intelligence can only receive stimuli transmitted by sense and associate them with one another, true education is of course impossible, since the ideas and principles that permit the growth of knowledge and understanding are lacking. In this case, then, neither the lash of the rod, nor cries, nor method, nor examples, nor time, nor experience, nor anything in nature can sufficiently excite him to bring forth anything. Huarte's framework is useful for discussing psychological theory in the ensuing period. Typical of later thought is his reference to use of language as an index of human intelligence, of what distinguishes man from animals, and specifically his emphasis on the creative capacity of normal intelligence. These concern dominated rationalist psychology and linguistics. With the rise of Romanticism, attention shifted to the third type of wit, to true creativity, although the rationalist assumption that normal human intelligence is uniquely free and creative and beyond the bounds of mechanical explanation was not abandoned and played an important role in the psychology of Romanticism and even in its social philosophy. And so, that is the second part to linguistic contributions of the past in Noam Chomsky's Language and Mind.